deine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich nicht in diesem...
In the early 1930s, the world was reeling from the aftermath of the Great Depression. The global economy was in tatters, and many countries were looking for a solution. In Germany, the situation was particularly dire. Enter Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party, who promised to restore Germany to its former glory. They didn't just want power, they wanted to reshape the world in their own twisted image, and so, in 1933, Hitler became Chancellor. From there, the nightmare unfolded. The Nazis used propaganda, fear, and violence to create a totalitarian regime where opposition was silenced, and dissent was crushed with ruthless efficiency. But what happened next? What were the terrifying events that followed the rise of Hitler? The first chilling step the Nazis took was to target the political enemies of the state. Leftists, communists, and anyone opposed to Hitler's vision were arrested, imprisoned, or worse. In 1933, the Reichstag fire allowed Hitler to push through emergency powers, suspending civil liberties and enabling mass arrests. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, became notorious for their brutal tactics. People disappeared without warning, often tortured or executed in secret. But that was just the beginning. As Hitler consolidated power, he began to implement his horrific vision of racial purity. Jews, Roma people, disabled individuals, Slavs, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazis were systematically persecuted. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of their citizenship and basic rights, segregating them from the rest of the population. But the laws were just the beginning of the horrors that awaited them. The infamous Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, on November 9, 1938, marked a terrifying turning point. In a coordinated effort, Nazi forces across Germany and Austria destroyed Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues. Hundreds of Jews were murdered, and thousands were arrested. It was the beginning of the dehumanization of an entire population, setting the stage for the atrocities to come. But it wasn't just the Jews who were targeted. The Nazis had an even darker plan in store for them, one that would lead to the systematic murder of 6 million Jews. This plan, known as the Final Solution, was devised to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. The Nazis built concentration camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau, and so many more, where men, women, and children were tortured, starved, and gassed to death. The gas chambers were a mechanical marvel of death, designed to kill as efficiently as possible. Imagine, listeners, walking into a place where there is no mercy, no humanity. The silence of the dead could almost be heard through the walls of these camps. People were stripped of their names, their identities, and reduced to mere numbers, a chilling reminder of the extent of the Nazis' dehumanizing agenda. And while the death camps were where the systematic genocide unfolded, it wasn't the only form of terror under the Nazi regime. Let's talk about the medical experiments, the grotesque violations of human rights that occurred in the name of science. In places like Auschwitz, doctors under the leadership of men like Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, conducted horrific experiments on inmates. These experiments included testing poisons, forcing twins to undergo brutal surgeries without anesthesia, and attempting to cure disabilities by subjecting people to cruel, often fatal treatments. Mengele and his colleagues didn't just kill, they tortured in the name of twisted, pseudoscientific theories. Prisoners were seen as nothing more than lab rats to these doctors. And the worst part? Many of these experiments were conducted in full knowledge of their hopelessness. The suffering inflicted on these victims is beyond imagination. But let's step back for a moment, listeners. The terrifying scope of the Nazi atrocities didn't just happen in the concentration camps, it spilled out into the streets, the homes, and the hearts of every person in Nazi-occupied Europe. The violence was pervasive. In the occupied territories, people lived in constant fear of betrayal, deportation, and death. Communities were torn apart, families displaced, and cities burned. There was no escape from the all-consuming terror of Nazi rule. In countries like Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, resistance movements fought back, though they were often brutally suppressed. The Nazis didn't tolerate dissent, and those caught fighting against them were often executed. Resistance fighters, Jews in hiding, and anyone thought to be an enemy of the state lived in a constant state of fear. But let's not forget the terror of the bombing campaigns that spread across Europe during World War II. The Blitz, in which Germany launched relentless bombing raids on Britain, was an effort to break the morale of the British people. The devastation was immense. Thousands died in these bombings, and cities like London were left in ruins. It was a terror that rained down from the sky, an inescapable nightmare for those on the ground. And of course, we can't talk about the Nazis without mentioning the horrors of the Eastern Front. As German forces pushed eastward, they encountered resistance in places like Stalingrad, and millions of soldiers and civilians perished. The brutality of the German occupation was unimaginable. In Ukraine, for example, the Nazis orchestrated mass starvation, known as the Holodomor, which killed millions of people. But the terror did not end with the war's end. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, the world had to confront the aftermath of the Holocaust and the devastation left by the Nazi regime. Trials were held to bring Nazi war criminals to justice, most notably the Nuremberg trials. But even with these trials, the psychological scars left by the Nazis' reign of terror continue to haunt the world to this day.